Our show today is brought to you by NutriTrain Southwest, approved by the Royal Society for Public Health to offer courses in nutrition and health.
Hello and welcome to the Light and Energy Show with me, Claire Wiles. We're here today with Andrew Cowling, good friend of mine and herbalist, and we're going to have a local walk to look at the herbs that grow wild within the local environment with a lovely bunch of people here who are going to join us, and Andrew's going to tell us all about the medicinal properties of the herbs that grow in our area. So welcome Andrew to the show, thanks for joining us today. And we're really looking forward to finding more out about the herbs. Okay, everybody, shall we go?
The beautiful thing about railways is you get these lovely wild environments that apart from the fact they put weed killer on bits of it, there's a huge amount of vegetation growing there because it's a railway, and we'll see some quite interesting plants on that side of the road as well as this side. But you just notice as you walk up through here the sort of cotoneaster type stuff, which actually originated in China. And certainly on Portland is a menace. They're actually using flamethrowers to try and get rid of it because it squeezes out the native plants. And then when we go into the park, again, you'll see plants that have been cultivated from wild plants. So you'll see the contrast between a wild environment and a natural one. There are little sycamores growing everywhere. Do you see? They're very vigorous sycamores. It's not used nowadays, but in days gone by, it shows up in the old herbals as they used to get the resin or the sap from sycamore and make it in lozenges, and it was reputed to be anti-tumour. A lot of plants have got a reputation for being anti-tumour. One or two we'll see later, which are still used in modern herbal medicine, but sycamore isn't. But people used to suck lozenges of the sap. Another group, really, there's grasses. I'm no expert at defining grass species, but again, the only grass that's got medicinal value, believe it or not, is couch grass. And herbalists, everybody else hates couch grass, herbalists love it. You use the stolons, which are the underground roots, which are the bits that cause gardeners the problem, and they're a very soothing diuretic. So if I make someone a medicine for cystitis, for example, any inflammation in the urinary system, I would almost always include couch grass, a really nice soothing diuretic. The reason it works as a diuretic is it's got a sugar in it. I can't remember that, I think it might be mannitol, but it's got a sugar in it that isn't absorbed or broken down in the body. And as the sugar goes through the kidney, it pulls water with it, and that's how it acts as a diuretic. I've only ever once seen couch grass standing above ground, and Bob Ford, who some of you may know, actually told me that's couch grass. I would never have known, and the only way you could tell was when it was in flower. But of course, if you start digging, it's very easy to tell which is couch grass and which is other types of grass. So a very useful plant to a herbalist. Then you need to know which bit of the plant to use, and it varies. There is no way of working it out. You just have to know. Basically, it's one of those things you just have to learn. So, but if you use the wrong bit of the plant, most times you won't get any benefit. Occasionally, if you get it wrong, you'll positively damage yourself. So it is important to know which bit to use. The name tells you, Toadflax. It is a member of the flax family, and there are some of them are farmed, aren't they? People farm flax for fibre and stuff. And you can grow flax in your garden. If you do, it's very invasive. Someone gave me some flax and I put it in the garden. Beautiful little pale blue flowers, but I've never quite managed to get rid of it since. It just goes everywhere. So that's Toadflax, but it's absolutely beautiful, isn't it? Blackberry is quite a useful plant. It's an astringent. It's got astringent qualities, which means it protects mucous membranes. So blackberry is particularly good for the digestive system. You could you can make a tea from blackberry. You should really use the roots, but they're fairly difficult to get out of the ground, blackberry roots, so you could use the leaves, less effective, and you could make a gargle with blackberry. You make an infusion, wait for it to cool down and gargle with it if you had a sore throat. Very good for diarrhea. If you had diarrhea, astringents will actually stop it. Now, natural medicine says if you've got diarrhea, you don't actually try to stop it. But there are circumstances where it might be quite valid to do so. So if you've got an infection, natural medicine would say don't try and stop the diarrhea. But if your gut is inflamed for some other reason, and there are other reasons, colitis for example, then using astringents is a perfectly valid way of trying to protect the wall of the gut and to actually help it to heal. I don't use blackberry. We're spoilt for choice with astringents, so I tend to use a lot of agrimony, and there isn't any agrimony around here, so I can't show you, but it does grow on Portland. If you see a plant on Portland with little spikes, or quite long spikes with tiny little yellow flowers, particularly on the West Cliff, that's agrimony, a lovely little plant. And I use agrimony. Horse chestnut's another very good astringent, and one of the strongest is oak, if you use oak bark. A very powerful astringent. Let's move on a bit. I had a poke around here yesterday just to actually see what was about, and I was really enthralled to find this, because I'm quite sure this wasn't here last year, and I certainly didn't see it. The plant with the little yellow flowers, does anyone know what that is?
Is that pulsatilla?
No. There's a bunch there and there's a bunch over here. It's I can't be 100% sure because I can't get close enough to look at the leaf, but I put 99% sure that's St. John's wort. Now I'm sure it's St. John's wort because it's where it's growing, it's wild, and we'll see the domestic variety of Hypericum when we go into the park. St. John's wort is Hypericum perforatum, but there are domestic versions, and generally when you get domestic versions of wild plants, what they've done, they made the flowers much bigger, and you'll see that when we go in the park. But that, I'm almost certain, is St. John's wort. It is flowering at exactly the right time. When's St. John's Day?
No idea.
Huh? 24th of June. 24th of June, yeah. And I didn't do it this year, but normally if I grow St. John's wort, normally if I harvest it, tradition says you harvest St. John's wort on the 24th of June. It has to be a nice sunny day to do it for obvious reasons, but that's the day to harvest St. John's wort. So it's in its prime. That looks a little bit undernourished, I must say, but St. John's wort. People know what it's used for? Depression. Yeah, it's probably the best remedy we've got in herbal medicine for depression. But what people forget is herbs often do a lot more than one thing. So St. John's wort is very definitely good for depression, but it's also seen as a tonic. A lot of herbs herbalists use are seen as foods as much as they are medicines. So St. John's wort is a good example of a plant that will strengthen the nervous system. And obviously if someone is depressed, that often would be a good sort of secondary thing to try to do as well. To me, the best tonic, we won't see any today, the best tonic for the nervous system is oats, believe it or not. So if your nervous system is feeling drained, do you still do organic porridge, Claire?
I do, but I haven't got it.
Get some organic rolled oats from Claire. It's strengthen, eat porridge. But St. John's wort is a good nerve tonic. It's also specific for irritability, and that's often forgotten. So it's a herb I sometimes prescribe if someone asks me to treat premenstrual syndrome, for example. It just has, it's a relaxing, but it calms down that tendency towards irritability. Another thing that's actually, this is one of the marvels of plants really, you can see you've got green leaves and yellow flowers. You can make an oil for St. John's wort, which is really good for the skin, but particularly for when you've damaged your skin, if you've sunburnt it, things like that. And also for nerve pain, it's an old remedy for neuralgia. What you do is you pick the flowers of St. John's wort, you put them in a glass jar, and you cover it with good quality olive oil, and you leave it in the sun for about 6 weeks. Now normally with herbs, the last thing you do is leave it in the sun, because generally the sunshine denatures plants. That's why herbalists keep their medicines in the dark. If you have a bottle of tincture from a herbalist, it will be in a brown bottle. It's to protect it from the light. But you have to leave this in the sunshine. And after 6 weeks, you press the oil out of the plant material and you get this lovely deep crimson oil. Absolutely fantastic. How do you get crimson oil from green leaves and yellow flowers? I don't know. It's one of the sort of miracles of nature to me. So you can make an oil, and you can do that yourself, obviously. Just make an oil. Very soothing on damaged skin. So there's some St. John's wort growing wild by the railway line. Isn't it wonderful to have railways? Herbalists use rose as a plant. You use the flowers, and people like me would use the original old-fashioned roses, Rosa canina or Rosa damascena, the real old-fashioned English roses. I don't use it very much, but rose is specific for grief. It's a herb of the heart. So often what I do, if I get someone who is had a loss, is grieving, if they need medicine for other purposes, then I put a little bit of rose tincture in the medicine, and a tiny amount, maybe 5 mils in 100, so 5%. So it wouldn't really have a pharmacological effect. I'm looking at an energetic effect. Or alternatively, if someone just wants some help with grieving, then I give them a little bottle of rose tincture and a dropper bottle, and rather like you do the rescue remedy, in fact, you just, when you're really struggling, just drop it under your tongue. And universally, when I've done that with people, people always say it really helped. So it's a really effective remedy. This is tincture of rose. I suppose I wouldn't use oil of rose. I mean, you won't stop putting essential oil of rose on your tongue, obviously. You need to drink it. Essential oil of rose will do other things completely. But a really good remedy for grief. And you could, I think, if you wanted to do it yourself, make a tea. You could make a tea and drink the tea. But the easiest way of all is to have a tincture and do it in drops. Very effective. And it actually smells like roses. It's one of the most beautiful smelling tinctures. Most people complain about the smell and taste of tinctures. But in fact, rose is absolutely beautiful. I love to just smell it because it just smells like a liquid rose. So I wouldn't make it from those, but they are quite pretty, aren't they? This little bush here, again, I'm not a botanist, so I'm not quite sure whether it's it's prickly. I should have known that. A domestic species. Anyone recognise it?
Hawthorn.
Yeah, it's Hawthorn. Crataegus oxyacantha would be the one that herbalists use. Again, it's interesting. It's right next to the rose, because in fact Hawthorn is a heart herb. A wonderful plant to use. We have these strange things in herbal medicines that plants act as balancers. So whichever way you're out of balance, if you take some herbs, they will bring you back into balance. So for example, Hawthorn is a key remedy to use in treating high blood pressure, but also if your blood pressure is too low, it's generally reckoned that Hawthorn will help to bring it back up again. Now, I've never actually used that with anyone, because generally if you've got low blood pressure, you just sort of be thankful you've got it. Don't try and push it up. But in other words, amphoteric is a technical word. It means it will move you one way or the other according to which way you need your balance to move. But it's generally a good heart herb. As well as using it to treat blood pressure, I would use it for any condition with the heart, including emotional conditions. It's known to strengthen the action of the heart. So the actual contraction of the heart, it strengthens. Now, where I find that's important, I figured this out for myself a long time ago, really by accident, trying to treat people with chronic fatigue syndrome type problems, very poor energy, just chronic poor health. What I realised was the blood pressures vary. I've treated people with chronic fatigue syndrome with high blood pressure, normal blood pressure and low blood pressure. What I've always found is when you listen to their pulse, doesn't matter what their pulse rate is, the pulse is often quite difficult to find, and it's poorly defined. So instead of having a nice bump, 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 you often find thump, thump, that sort of sound. It just feels as if it just doesn't feel very good. If you give Hawthorn, within 2 or 3 weeks, if you feel that person's pulse again, you will hear a much healthier, much more robust, much more vitality in the pulse. And that's very important if you've got something like chronic fatigue syndrome, to me, to actually address that type of problem. It's also very important that it's a technique that is being lost when pulses are taken. If too much of it is done by machinery, it tells you how fast it is, but it tells you nothing about the quality of the pulse. Now, in Chinese traditional herbal medicine, they place huge emphasis on things like pulse diagnosis, tongue diagnosis. I have to say I don't follow that model, but I do get a lot of knowledge about how a person is just by listening to the pulse. Obviously, I'm concerned about how fast or how slow it is, but it's what else does it tell you about the person. And you can only do that by putting your fingers on a pulse and just sensing how it is. If you use a machine, it's the same with taking people's blood pressure. You can use little electronic machines to do it, and it will tell you exactly what a person's blood pressure is, but you won't hear what does it sound like through the stethoscope. And that tells you a lot about how a person is, as well about where is their blood pressure. So very important, these clinical skills, that we shouldn't lose them. So hawthorn's central to circulatory problems very definitely, and anywhere where I feel there's a circulatory problem to be addressed, even poor circulation, cold hands and feet. You can use things like ginger and cayenne to put heat into the body, but you can also use hawthorn to address the heart in terms of strengthening the heart if you feel that's needed. So a wonderful plant. In terms of the parts used, you can use the flowering tops or you can use the berries. And it's one of those good examples where herbalists don't agree. Herbalists have their own preferences as to which they use, and there is no right or wrong. I tend to prefer the berries. I don't know why, I've always just used the berries, but other herbalists will maintain, no, I always use the flowering tops. You can use either, and it is one of those things in herbal medicine where it's purely a personal preference. But almost universally used by herbalists, that's a hawthorn. Here's another one. Do you know what this is? It's Cleavers. Do you want to...
Sticky.
Yeah,
I know what it's like.
Anyone not felt Cleavers? Important thing about herbal medicine, you actually need to feel plants and touch them. I'll keep it away from my jumper. But what does it tell you about the plant? Yeah, this is Cleavers. Sticky willy's another name for obvious reasons. Gallium aperine is the Latin name. Herbalists use Latin. When you write a prescription, you write the prescription in Latin, and that's for the avoidance of doubt. In other words, if anyone else read your prescription anywhere in the world, if they could read Latin, then they would know if I've written Gallium aperine, no, that's what I've prescribed. If you write Cleavers, or already we've got two names, Cleavers, Sticky Willy, and there are various other names, then the minute you start using English names when you're prescribing, you introduce a possibility of error. A good example of that is a dandelion. We'll see a dandelion a bit later on if you've forgotten what they look like. But I did a bit of research years ago in the old herbals. How many different names could you find for dandelion? And I got about 40 different names. Now, a lot of those will have disappeared now because they date from the time when they were very regional names, and people in Yorkshire would have nil contact with people in Weymouth. So the same plant was called different things. But the dandelion is a good example of, if you say Taraxacum officinale, all of us know what that means. But if you call it dandelion or lion's tooth or piss the bed or pissenlit or the clock plant, just a few, potentially you've got a problem with identification. So that's why herbalists use Latin, so that for the avoidance of doubt. And clearly when you're prescribing medicines, you have to make sure that people get the right thing. So there's oh, I didn't say what it was for, did I? Cleavers. It's a lymphatic herb. Any problem with the lymph system, you use Cleavers. So swollen glands are simply a sign that you're fighting infection. They're not a bad thing in themselves. Having an infection is, but your swollen glands actually tell you your immune system has kicked into action. But if your glands stay up for too long or they become congested, herbalists love the word congestion, then you use Cleavers. It's a very good diuretic, but it's very good for the lymph system. It helps to keep the lymph moving, keep it circulating. It's got a reputation, interestingly, as an anti-tumour remedy. And that links into some of the older herbalists, including John Wesley, who I'll say a little bit about in a minute, recognised that and said it was for the dispersion of hard lumps. Well, that's a pretty good definition of a tumour, isn't it? When you don't, with John Wesley, was he any Methodists here? Was he 17th century or 18th century? I can't remember. Anyway, a long time ago. For the dispersion of hard lumps. John Wesley was interesting. He wasn't a herbalist. I mean, he was a nonconformist. The Wesleys broke away from the Church of England, didn't they? So they were rather unorthodox. And John Wesley went around the country preaching their version of the gospel. What he also did, he had a little book of folk remedies. They weren't just herbal remedies, they also involved minerals and various chemicals, some of it not too savoury, I have to say, in this day and age, but he used to sell this little book for a minimal amount. And of course, the Wesleys tended to go around to country areas where people were very poor and generally speaking wouldn't have a doctor in the neighbourhood or wouldn't be able to afford to go to one. So they were very much more dependent on folk medicine, if you like. And the reason John Wesley sold his little pamphlet was to help people to treat themselves. by using simple remedies such as Cleavers, for example. And someone lent me a copy. Unfortunately, they wanted it back. I think someone lent me a copy of this 3 or 4 years ago, and it was a fascinating read. But John Wesley did more than just walk around the country preaching. Again, he was challenging orthodoxy. So the other thing about Cleavers, allegedly you can use it as a wash. If you've got freckles and you're not too keen on freckles, make a tea, an infusion, let it go cold and use it as a face wash. And it's supposed to lighten freckles. So there. This is interesting because it's a sort of semi-naturalised little piece of garden that someone at the Centenary Club a few years ago, clearly it was their pride and joy. They set out to create a nice little garden with a number of different plants and herbs in it, and it's really been neglected, as you can see. But what is still here are common or garden plants. This one is probably the most prominent. Do you know what this is? It's fennel. Yeah, fennel. It's it's absolutely wonderful aromatic plant. You just have some seeds and absolutely lovely. The other thing you do with herbs, provided you know what you're doing, is you can eat them. But certainly, if you don't know what fennel tastes like or smells like, you just rub it and smell it. It's wonderful aromatic scent. This isn't the same fennel that you eat. The fennel that you eat with the big bulb has been grown and developed for that purpose. But this is, I would say, even though I'm not a botanist, this is the proper fennel, feniculum. And it's a really good digestive herb. It's called a carminative, which means it soothes the digestion. So very good for any type of disturbed digestion, particularly in the gut rather than the stomach. But it's good if your digestion is just upset, if it's tense, irritable bowel, if you're bloated with gas bloating, for example. Fennel, you could drink fennel tea. Which bit of the plant is used? The seeds. Yeah, you use the seeds. They're just developing now. This is still quite young, you can see, and they'll grow a lot bigger than that yet. You use the seeds. But a very good digestive remedy. It's one of the remedies that you could use with a baby with colic. The old treatments for colic were dill water is the commonest one, isn't it? Well, dill, fennel, caraway, aniseed, they're all the same family, and they will all effectively do the same thing. Again, it's a bit personal preference which you like to use. My preference is fennel. That's the one I use. So you could treat colic with fennel if you wanted to. Gripe water, if you look at the contents of gripe water, if you can still get it. I had a few years ago, my youngest grandson, he suffered a lot from colic. So my daughter-in-law phoned out and said, what can I give him? So I said, well, see if you can get him some dill water or some gripe water. So she went to a local chemist and said what she wanted, and of course, what do you want it for? Well, my baby's got colic. Oh no, you don't want that. I've got a real nice modern thing, you see. Try to sell her some chemical. And she actually be quite assertive, say, no, I don't want whatever it was he was trying to sell her. My father-in-law's a herbalist, and he said to give him gripe water. And in the end, he sort of begrudgingly sold her gripe water. But it's very effective, it really does work. So in that sense, it's a nice, gentle plant. It's also a galactagogue. Does anyone know what galactagogues do? They promote the flow of breast milk. So they're very important. If you're a nursing mum, if you really want to nurse your baby, and if you're not producing enough milk, that can be very stressful. All the women here, I'm sure, will understand that far better than I would. Very stressful. And the problem is, the more tense and stressed you get because you can't produce enough milk, the less milk you produce, and the more irritable your baby gets. So it's quite a nasty problem, really. This is one of the herbs you could use to treat that. When I haven't had anyone for a long time who asked for help, but when I have, I would use a hormone balancer, because it's partly you're looking to bring hormones back into balance. So Agnus castor, so we won't see any Agnus castors today, you'd have to go to Greece. But a hormone balancer, chasteberry, vitex, the same plant. Hormone balancer, but Also, always use a nerve relaxant. I always used to give women nerve relaxants to get tension out of them, to allow the process to occur. It's not about making things happen, it's allowing things to happen, facilitating. And then galactagogues. This is a galactagogue, aniseed, caraway, those are aromatic plants are. Another one that's a very good galactagogue is borage. Have you come across borage? No? We won't see any today, there isn't any about. Borage is a wonderful herb, it's a good galactagogue, it's a tonic for the adrenal glands, and it lifts the spirit. Now in herbal medicine, herbalists differentiate between being low in mood and low in spirit. So St. John's wort, generally speaking, is about mood, it's about addressing a low mood, and it's called an antidepressant. Herbs like borage, and vervain is another one, a druid herb, vervain, Verbena officinalis. We won't see that today, but they're known as thymoleptics in the trade, and a thymoleptic means it lifts the spirit. And to me there is a difference between someone who's low in mood and someone who's low in spirit. You can often be both, but sometimes I come across people who are just low in spirit. Nothing wrong with their mood, they're just low in spirit. Then borage would be a good example. I've deviated a bit because what I was going to finish up saying is borage is another galactagogue. Lots of galactagogues. Stinging nettle, we'll see lots of stinging nettle in a minute, one of my favourite plants. That's a galactagogue as well. You have to be very careful. You have to be quite careful about what you mean. People come to herbalists and they say, I've got a problem with my stomach, and I usually say, show me your stomach, and people do that. Well, that's your abdomen, that's your gut, if you like. So you have to be, when people say stomach, we do tend to refer to that, don't we? But technically there's some quite fundamental differences in terms of what will be wrong. So I tend to use peppermint to treat problems with the stomach. So acid indigestion, for example, acid reflux, peppermint might be one of the herbs you use. Nausea, it's a good remedy for nausea, peppermint. Not everyone appreciates it. It's one of these things that arouse strong views. Some people say, if I drank peppermint when I was feeling sick, it really would make me sick. And it's the same with ginger, a really good remedy for nausea. Morning sickness in pregnancy is specific, but I've come across women who just can't face ginger tea. And I just cross my fingers and hope they like peppermint instead. So the mint, very good. It's one of the herbs that Orthodox medicine still uses, or they use the oil of peppermint, and they use it to treat irritable bowel syndrome. Now the problem with a herbalist in treating the gut, which is what you would be talking about, is that peppermint, generally speaking, gets absorbed in the stomach and it doesn't get through to the gut. So if you go to a doctor and they prescribe you essential oil of peppermint, it will be in a, and I've just completely forgotten the word.
An enteric coated.
Thank you, an enteric. That was a wonderful duet, wasn't it? An enteric coat, and the enteric coat means it gets through the stomach and into the gut before it gets released, and that's how they do it. I don't have the means to prescribe an enteric coat to a herb, so I'm at a disadvantage, but it's interesting that it is still prescribed by Orthodox medicine. Rosmarinus officinalis, again a wonderful aromatic herb. Rosemary for remembrance, rosemary for remembrance, in two ways. Culturally, it was, and it still is in some parts of the world, it's put in the coffin or with the dead body when they're buried. As sort of, it's like a teaching aid, isn't it? So you remember the person who's died. But I'm not interested in that as a herbalist, really. I'm interested in what does it do for the living. Rosemary for remembrance, it improves mental functioning. It's an aid to memory. It's generally thought to increase blood flow to the brain. Interesting, you can use it with people with chronic fatigue syndrome, because there is evidence that that's one of the problems that chronic fatigue syndrome involves, is a poor blood flow to the brain. Now if we'd all like a better memory than we've got. We'd all like to be more intelligent than we actually are, I'm quite sure. But actually if you take rosemary, I don't think it does that. I think it really only improves your mental functioning if it's impaired. But it is a very good remedy from that point of view. Again, it's an amphoteric remedy. It does two apparently opposite things. It's relaxing, but at the same time it's brightening. That's not the same as stimulating. Stimulating to me is caffeine. And generally herbalists don't use stimulants of that nature, but it livens up, it stimulates the brain, it helps it to work better as well as relaxing it. And again, it's a mood lifter, it'll just make you feel better. So a lovely plant. Again, use the aerial parts, and when I say aerial parts, it means everything above ground. If I was going to use it, I would tend to be looking for the soft tips. In other words, you could use the woody bits, but it's harder. If you make a tea, you're not going to get much out of them. So I would be looking for the little tips. Rosemary tea is, I mean, it's again, some people drink this stuff recreationally. There's some plants you can drink simply because they taste nice. And rosemary tea is a nice one. It's a very easy plant to grow. It's an evergreen, so it's available to you all the year round. And very effective plant. When I took my final exams as a herbalist, for 6 weeks before, when I was revising, I drank a mixture of rosemary and sage tea. Again, sage, the old Anglo-Saxon word swage. Sage is a wise person, isn't it? Sage. Again, sage is reputed to have that effect of improving intellect. I drank rosemary and sage tea for 6 weeks before I took my exams. And I passed. It had to work. So that's rosemary. Is there anything else? Well, yes, they're here. So the remains of red hot pokers, to my knowledge, have no medicinal value at all. But what we've got here, you all know this? Dandelion. Again, it's a bit like the stinging nettle. To most people, dandelions are at least unpopular, but to a herbalist, it's a really valuable resource. Taraxacum officinale, and there are lots of plants that look like dandelions but aren't. There are quite a few around here. You might think of dandelions, and I think I saw one back here somewhere. I don't know where they are, dandelions. No, the one towards the end there, at face value, you might immediately think there's one nearer to the end that they look like dandelions, but in fact they're not. So you have to be careful you've got the right plant. But a dandelion, again, you have to be careful which bit of the plant you use, because in fact it does two completely different things. The leaves do one thing and the root does another. The flowers are useful only for wine, no medicinal value. What do the leaves do? Does anyone know? They're diuretic. What does diuretic mean? Yes, it increases the flow of urine. And you might say, well, why do you want to do that? Well, there'll be various reasons you want to do it. One of the reasons might be if you've got a problem with water retention, fluid retention. Now, as a herbalist, I don't use a diuretic simply to get water out of the body, because I'm also going to look at why is that happening. So you would be using other herbs to try and address the underlying problem. But certainly it's a very powerful diuretic, and it is the leaves that do it. One of the things you have to be careful about when you use diuretics is you tend to flush potassium out of the body as you do it. And so you need to make sure you have an adequate replenishment of potassium, because if you upset the potassium, calcium, sodium balances in your body, that's crucial to the life of every single cell that you've got. So very important not to mess around too much with it. Interestingly, dandelion leaf is very rich in potassium. And a few years ago, people did research on potassium levels. People drank lots of dandelion tea, and then they tested potassium levels. The net potassium level in the body after you'd taken dandelion tea over a period of time had actually gone up. So one of nature's ways of balance, nature's very clever in this way, and we often don't realise it, there is that natural balance in dandelion leaf. The root, what's the root good for? Yeah, generally speaking, the liver. It's a liver herb. And herbalists will say you use dandelion to promote the flow of bile. What that really means is you give it to people who've got signs of liver congestion. And often our livers are congested simply because of our lifestyle, the food we eat, the chemicals we ingest, the lack of exercise and so on and so forth. Our livers are congested. Your liver is really important because it processes all sorts of waste materials out of your body. And if it's not working very well, then sooner or later it will affect your health. So one of the ways you address that problem is to use herbs like dandelion. There are a lot of herbs that are good for the liver, but dandelion is probably number one amongst herbalists. Milk thistle was another one. I actually bought you won't see any milk thistle, but when we go back, I brought a bag of herbs because the weather forecast said it might rain. And I've got a little milk thistle. So if you want to see what a milk thistle looks like, when we go back, I'll show you. Milk thistle is also a very good liver herb, but the difference, which often people don't realise, is milk thistle has this extra capacity to repair damage to liver cells, the hepatocytes. that's clinically established. It actually aids the repair. So I would always use milk thistle if there were signs, either medically or socially, that a person was actually damaging their liver as opposed to just congested. So people with a heavy use of alcohol, for example, where you clearly are going to suffer long-term liver damage, that's where milk thistle would definitely be indicated. I would use the two together, in fact, but I would use dandelion if the person was generally showing signs of congestion, constipation being a common one. Dandelion is said to increase the flow of bile, and bile is nature's laxative. And often when I've got people who are just constipated for no apparent reason, I mean, if they're eating McDonald's all the time and a rubbish diet, then actually that's why they're constipated. But I often get people perfectly healthy, they lead good healthy lives in terms of their diet and so on, but they're still a bit sluggish. Often dandelion root is all you need just to sort that problem out. It just puts more bile through the gut, and that's all you need, a lovely natural way to solve a problem with constipation. Do you know about senna? Everyone knows senna, senna-cot? Senna's a herb, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, very regularly prescribed by GPs. Herbalists rarely use senna because senna works in a different way. Senna is an irritating laxative, and the way it works, it irritates, when you take it, it irritates the wall of the bowel, and that makes the bowel expel the contents. That's a fairly crude way to deal with constipation. My training was you only used an irritating laxative like senna at such time as the person was totally bunged up and to get them on the move. Once you got the bowel moving, then you set about what was called re-educating the bowel. And I don't keep senna, I keep one of the rhubarbs, Turkey rhubarb, all the rhubarbs, not the sticks that you eat, but the leaves. If you eat the leaves, it will have that effect, aperient or stimulating laxative. They'll all have that effect. In 16 years of practice, I've only ever used it twice. And to be honest, that's not enough, not frequently enough to know. I'm never really quite sure how much do I give a person to get a result, because I haven't had enough experience of using it. I've always approached constipation more from the dandelion root angle, and almost always got a result. Another herb that you can use, and I often use it with dandelion to bulk up the stool, is psyllium seed. Have you come across psyllium seed? Yeah, linseeds are another well-known remedy. What they do, and some of the orthodox remedies like lactulose and fibrogel work on the same basis. They hold moisture in the gut, and that bulks up the stool. But you can do it with psyllium seeds, or you can do it with linseeds, people often use. Linseeds are good because they're full of natural oils as well, but they're a good if you've got a problem with constipation. So that's a dandelion, wonderful plant. But that's very definitely a chamomile, but I can't say exactly what chamomile it is. Herbalists use two, Roman chamomile, which is Chamomile nobile, and German chamomile, which is, depends on your preference, Matricera recutita or Chamomilla recutita. They're both Latin names are used. That is certainly not Roman chamomile. It could be Chamomilla recutita, but it's definitely chamomile family. Everyone know chamomile? You know, often people say, when I say was wonderful chamomile, people say, it's horrible. If you bought Holland and Barrett type chamomile tea bags and you didn't like them, come and see me and I'll give you some loose chamomile, and you make it properly in a teapot. It is a completely different taste. It's like the difference between instant coffee and percolated coffee. It is fundamentally different. And to me, real chamomile tastes, I mean, you may not like it, but you'll have to acknowledge it really does taste different. But you really do have to use the loose chamomile. I think that is a problem with a lot of herbs in tea bags. It's a bit like there is no comparison with tea bag tea with real tea. And we've gone down the tea bag route for convenience sake, but we've lost a lot in terms of flavour. But chamomile, a really nice gentle calming herb, although often more powerful than you might think. I always get good results with chamomile, but it's a really good herb for children because it is that gentler thing. But we know about its calming effect. What you may not know, it's a very good gut herb. It's very good for the abdomen. So I often use it to treat irritable bowel syndrome, but it's also an anti-inflammatory for the gut. And sometimes when you get someone who's got the signs of irritable bowel, it can be very difficult to know is it just the state of tension in the bowel, or is there a degree of inflammation in the bowel wall? If the IBS is with loose bowels, for example, you are left wondering, is there any inflammation there? Well, chamomile is a really good anti-inflammatory. So if I'm not sure what's going on, I'll use chamomile to get the calming effect on the gut as well as the anti-inflammatory effect. You recognise that? Yeah, it's plantain. Plantain. This one is called ribwort plantain because of the shape of the leaf. Plantago lanceolata, which again describes the shape of the leaf, doesn't it? Latin isn't just someone sat and made it up, it's often very descriptive and beautifully poetic. The other one is Plantago major, which I think we'll find a bit later. I can't see one here, but it's got a round leaf. They're both used in herbal medicine, and again, it's a matter of personal preference which you use. I keep Plantago lanceolata, it's an anti-catarrhal. So I would use it for catarrh here, upper respiratory catarrh, and it's specific for when there is blood in the catarrh. So it's also a bit hemostatic, in other words, it stops bleeding. And all that goes on, if your nasal passages are inflamed, the tiny little blood capillaries on an inflamed tissue can often just rupture, which is why you're more prone to nosebleeds if you've got a really nasty cold. It will help to address that. So if I get someone who's got a lot of nasal congestion and there's some blood in the mucus, that's specific. Everyone knows what this is. Stinging nettle. There's a great bank of stinging nettles all the way up through here. Urtica dioica. But you'd never have a problem identifying stinging nettle, would you? You just touch it. Does it sting you? It must be stinging nettle. Fantastic range of uses. So I don't really know where to start. It's good for reducing allergies. It's anti-allergy. So obviously if you're allergic to something, natural medicine says remove the source of the allergy. So for example, if you're allergic to duck feathers, you have a foam pillow. But there are lots of things that people are allergic to, you can't do that. The most obvious one is pollen. I mean, if you're allergic to pollen, you can't realistically escape it. You have to find a way of coping with the allergy. And stinging nettle is one of the herbs I would give people if someone asked me to make them a medicine for hay fever. On occasions, I've said to people sort of pop up on my allotment and said, have you got anything that's good for such and such? They don't actually want to come to me for a consultation, they just want to know. So, and someone actually said to me one day, you got anything good for hay fever? And I just said, there they were, right alongside my allotment, try stinging nettle tea, see if it helps. And that person actually said it really made a positive difference, just drinking stinging nettle tea. So very good for reducing the effect of all sorts of types of sensitivity allergy. It reduces bleeding, so it's traditionally used to treat heavy bleeding, heavy menstrual bleeding. And interestingly, it's also nutritive. Stinging nettles are full of minerals, but particularly iron. Now, if your periods are very heavy, you're likely for at least a part of your cycle, if not all of it, to be anemic to some degree. Well, if you take stinging nettles as a medicine to reduce heavy bleeding, then in fact it gives you a lovely natural iron supplement as well. So again, it's a nice tonic. It feeds your system where it needs feeding. So a good to reduce bleeding. It's an old, what's called an anti-rheumatic. Rheumatism is a sort of non-specific term, isn't it, for just general aches and pains. Now that can include arthritis, but it can include muscles as well. And it's generally an anti-rheumatic. Now it's thought to work, like lots of herbs, we say they're blood cleansers. No one really knows what that means, but we say, oh, it's a good blood cleanser. But generally speaking, it's believed that it helps to eliminate toxins that often cause problems in joints and muscles. And it's definitely an anti-arthritic remedy. It is diuretic, and that would definitely help in the way it removes toxins from the body. So sometimes I might use stinging nettle as part of a mix for someone who's got osteoarthritis. It's also used as what's called a counter-irritant. You heard of a counter-irritant? No? If you've got a toothache, do you know the effect of pinching the back of your hand? If you pinch it hard enough, the toothache, you don't notice the toothache. Yeah? If you've got a pain in one part of you, make something else hurt, your brain can only cope with so many pain messages at the same time, and it's a way of distracting attention from the real source of the pain. Now, if you've got osteoarthritis, an old remedy for osteoarthritis was to pick a handful of sting nettles and beat the joint. And it's not as daft as it sounds, because what it does, first of all, it's a counter irritant. So if you beat your hands, for example, it will make your hands sting, but I'll guarantee you won't feel the pain of the arthritis. Another thing it does, again, it's a galactagogue, increases the flow of breast milk. And in the old herbals, including the John Wesley one, it says it's also for women desiring an ample bust. So there, maybe there's a connection. Herbal medicine isn't just about tradition, it's changing. It is a dynamic process, and it doesn't necessarily mean we're discovering new herbs, because we probably aren't going to find many new ones in this country. There's a lot of stuff going on in the Amazon rainforest, some of it highly questionable, I think, where they're discovering plants. But in this country, we basically know. What I learnt when I trained, I finished in 1994. What I've talked about is more or less what I was taught about stinging nettle. Since then, people have researched the root of stinging nettle. All I've talked about is the aerial parts. Since then, people researched the root and came up with some really good evidence, this was from Germany, that in fact it's a really effective remedy for prostate problems, particularly what's called benign prostatic hypertrophy, which means enlargement of the prostate which is not malignant. So now I actually keep nettle root, and that's something that's come into practice, and it's quite widely used by herbalists since I trained. So it's just a nice example of the way we are still discovering things, even about a plant as common as the stinging nettle root. And it has to be nettle root that has those properties. For the purposes, for our purposes, we'll say it's willow. Herbalists use Salix alba, white willow, or Salix nigra, which is black willow. Why do we use willow? Full of salicylic acid, aspirin. And in willow, it's used not as a painkiller, it's used as an anti-inflammatory. So it's a standard herbal remedy for osteoarthritis. You can also use meadowsweet. We won't see any meadowsweet today. You can use meadowsweet, which I don't. My preference, I use meadowsweet for other things, but for osteoarthritis I always use willow. I use a lot of willow, and I use other herbs as well. You need to use a mixture of herbs to treat osteoarthritis, but willow is central, and it is primarily because of the amount of salicylic acid in it. It's a really good example of where you create a problem for yourself if you try and isolate a chemical from a plant. Because as you almost certainly know, the problem with taking aspirin as a single chemical is it irritates the lining of the stomach. You can take as much willow as you like and it won't do that, because there are hundreds, thousands of chemicals in a plant like willow, and there are all sorts of checks and balances which stop that effect of salicylic acid. In fact, meadowsweet, which is equally rich in salicylic acid, in fact is used as a remedy where the wall of the stomach is inflamed. So it actually has the opposite effect. So if you want to take an anti-inflammatory in its natural form, willow, meadowsweet. Devil's claw is another one, but devil's claw is not an English plant. I tend to think, why not use the plants that are here? So willow, very effective. And if you've got osteoarthritis, you have to be conscientious about taking your medicine. It takes a while to get it under control. But I've got people who've been coming to me for 10 years, and all they do, they just keep coming and picking up their repeat medicine, because I generally say it takes, sometimes it takes less, but I generally say you've got to be taking it for 2 or 3 months before you'll really notice some improvement. But then it will definitely keep it under control. And often that's what happens, but people who forget to phone me up and say, can I have some more medicine, will say they noticed they were getting worse again within a week of stopping the medicine, so it very quickly starts to flare up again. So beautiful, really very useful plant, willow. There are a couple of plants here that are worth looking at. Again, they're domesticated versions. This is mallow, and it's very definitely a domestic version of mallow. Their mallows grow all over the place, and they grow wild as well as in people's gardens. This one's not huge, it's a bit lanky, but it's got quite a striking colour to the flower, isn't it? It's a relative of marshmallow, which is what herbalists use. And marshmallow, again, I brought a piece of marshmallow with me so you can have a look at it and feel it. You can see the difference. Marshmallow is, texture-wise, very soft and soothing, and that's what marshmallow does. You can use the aerial parts, the leaves, or you can use the roots. I always use the root, and it's full of mucilage, so it's very good for soothing dry conditions or inflamed conditions in the lungs, the digestive system, and in the urinary system. So I would use marshmallow if someone had an irritated bladder or cystitis. Certainly if you've got one of these coughs which is hot and dry and it's non-productive, then I would always use marshmallow. But this is a domestic version. You could use it, but it won't have as much mucilage in it. And then this one is interesting. Does anyone recognise this one? No, it's a variety of echinacea, and I can't actually say other than that what it is. It will be a domestic one, and it's not flowering, so you can't tell what colour it's going to be even. But it's a variety of echinacea. Herbalists generally use Echinacea angustifolium or Echinacea purpureum. Current wisdom says actually you get the best effect if you use a mixture of the two. So when I make a tincture of Echinacea, I use a kilo of angustifolia and a kilo of purpureum dried herb and make the tincture half and half. That's current thinking. That one I've no idea what it is, but that's Echinacea. Fantastic support from the immune system. It is not, as a lot of people think, a stimulant. So people think, should I take it for variety? Does it stimulate the immune system? It's a much misused word. It doesn't. The evidence is it's very much more a support and a balancer of the immune system. And so you can use Echinacea on a long-term basis should you need to. I think a lot of people use it on a long-term basis. They do it sort of just in case sort of thing. And my view of that is, when people say, do you think I need to take Echinacea? I think you only take Echinacea if you've got signs that your immune system needs some help. If you're generally fit and well and healthy, you don't need to take it on an open-ended basis. But if you've got a chronic problem, chronic lung conditions, things like bronchiectasis, emphysema, where you're very much at increased risk of repeated infections, I prescribe it on an open-ended basis. Again, you use the root, and it is only the root that has any medicinal value. Often in the health food industry, and I'm not talking about Claire's shop, but the Hollands and Barretts of this world, they sell Echinacea root and leaf. They sell Echinacea root. The root will always be most expensive. Root and leaf, or something called Echinacea, I would say just don't touch it with a barge pole. There is no medicinal value in the aerial parts at all. Traditionally it's only ever been the root that's been used, but you can use angustifolia or purpureum. So that is probably neither of them, but it's very definitely an Echinacea. Coneflower is its English name, but it's one of these things that's always been known by its Latin name, isn't it? So those are those two, and just finally this one is a type of poppy, and this would be, you can tell by the structure, it's Papaver rheas, which would have those red flowers. You can use that as a cough medicine. I don't. You can use the petals of the flower. I don't use it, but you can. The other poppy is the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, and that's the one that's got the more sort of greyish green leaves. It is actually illegal for a herbalist to prescribe that because of its morphine content. I am not allowed by law to prescribe the opium poppy, so the consequence is I don't. Clearly it's very sedative. So there. So we'll draw to a conclusion there with these sort of domesticated versions. Thank you very much for your interest. We can all go back and have a drink now, I suppose, and a sit down.
So, well, what can I say? Thank you, Andrew, so much. A mine of information as always, and I'm sure I speak for everybody here to say how much we've enjoyed it this morning and how our walks in our local environment are going to be greatly enhanced by Andrew's knowledge. Everything that's Andrew said today, well, not everything, but key points of Andrew's talk today will be found on our show notes on www.thelightsandenergychannel.tv, and also links to the National Institution of Medical Herbalists as well. So please take a look there if you'd like this in note form. And thank you so much for joining me this morning. Thank you again, Andrew. So Enlightened Energy from me, Claire Wiles. Goodbye.
I wanted to take a few moments to tell you a little bit more about our sponsors, NutriTrain Southwest. They've been providing courses and qualifications in nutrition and health across the UK for the past 8 years. These can be studied by distance learning or in class, and they've been of benefit to many people, including those in the sport, leisure, health and care industries, but also to improve people's own health. To find out more about NutriTrain Southwest, visit www.nutritrainsouthwest.co.uk.